We can see and hear you, Dave.
Okay, great. So I titled it because we only have 30 minutes and it's not time enough to go into any depth on any one thing. I'm going to stay high level and just introduce you to the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, going over both regulatory and licensing. And I'll just start off with a little history of how it came about that there is a FCC. And then we'll go into a little bit of the regulatory and their role in administering the laws that Congress has adopted that regulate interstate commerce as it pertains to radio spectrum. It includes telephones and internet too. So we'll be doing that, and then we'll have a pretty good overview of the basics of the licensing process. So a little history. The first, if you will, FCC was titled the Federal Radio Commission, and it was established around 1915. And it was brought about because that's when the experiments from Marconi and others that established that you could actually do radio over the air broadcasts, they had been done, and it was starting to be introduced commercially, particularly for ships at sea, and then basically your AM radio later on. And so the Congress saw the need for some kind of structure, and so they started out with that. But the actual FCC was established in 1934. So that was the basic legislation that formed the FCC. The FCC, the legislation has been amended many times since then, but the FCC, it's an independent agency, and it's most agencies like BLM, the EPA, the Environmental Agency, Forest Service, all of those belong to the executive branch, the president. But the FCC actually reports directly back to Congress, and they were formed that way to administer the telecommunications law for Congress, because when Congress enacts legislation, they can't put every little detail into the law. And so what you have is you have a structure that the FCC fills in those details, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. Basically, there's 5 commissioners. They make the decisions, they vote. They're appointed by the president and confirmed by Congress. The 3 of them are from the president's party. So right now there's 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. If it changes in our election, then they'll change around that majority. But that's the traditional way that they are appointed and then confirmed by Congress. So the president appoints the commissioners, and then they're confirmed by Congress I think it's by both parties actually, but by the Senate in particular. And of course, as I've already said, they establish the regulations that actually govern our radio communications. And they make up all the little detailed rules and regulations, and you name it. They actually also have their own administrative law judges that you go before if there's a dispute in some cases. So all that sort of thing. And of course, since we heavily use in public safety land mobile radio, we're subject to their regulations. So the public safety use of spectrum is mainly regulated. It's called Title 47. Part 90 is for the land mobile radio, and Part 101 is for microwave. If you have a microwave system, then generally that falls under Part 101. And there's other parts. The parts 1 and 2 are primarily administrative. Part 97 is amateur radio. So there's lots of different parts. But if you ever need to look up a rule that you might not be sure about on your radio system or licensing, you can always Google Title 47 Part 90, and you'll find where the rules are at that you can get electronically or digitally on the internet. And that's a handy way of doing it, because believe me, when I first started out, we had to, we actually, well, you either got one book at the beginning of the year that was outdated by the end of the year, or even outdated by the time you got it, or the way we did it was we had to pay money and to a subscription service that sent out monthly a CD that gave us the rules. So it's much nicer now than when I first started out. And as you can imagine, any changes to the rules can have a great impact on public safety operations. Probably the one that's most familiar to everyone nowadays is the rebanding of the 800 megahertz spectrum. That impacted every state and every territory of the U.S. So, and we're still, to some extent, because of the Mexican border issues and whatnot, our region is still going through that. Just not much now, but it's still there. We haven't had the freeze lifted or things like that. So they can have a great impact. And it's always good, even if it's boring, to follow some of these proceedings. If you have an 800 megahertz system and there's what they call a notice of proposed rulemaking out, or they issue the other one that they issue is a report and order for the rule changes. That's when they actually make the changes, and sometimes they'll have a further notice of proposed rulemaking. All these things happen, so keep an eye on that. Gary and I try to report on it, mainly to alert you. It's hard to get into, a lot of details. Occasionally, CPRA has even written comments and filed them. So anyone can file in any of these proceedings. So all you need to do is write an informal letter, and it's all done online. So it's pretty easy. If your agency has an interest in one, it's a good way to make your views known. And it's best not to do a form letter type thing, but explain. If you are going to go ahead and put in comments on it, on what they call a docket or a proceeding that's going to change the rules, tell your story. Give them an introduction to your agency. Tell them the impact that it's going to have, if whatever it might be. For instance, 6 gigahertz microwave. For those agencies that run microwave, most of you, that's mission critical to you. It ties your radio sites together, or your offices together. There's critical data and voice that's sent across the microwave links. And so what does that mean if it goes down from interference? It may mean that your whole LMR system goes off the air, depending on where it is. So that's the kind of things that has an impact when you actually put in comments. Just a straight form letter that says, I don't like this, doesn't have much impact. Also, I've noticed some of the agencies have kind of they have the same, they use the services of the same communications lawyer, and so they'll put in joint comments. That makes it cheaper to file, and you also get the support of a lawyer actually drafting the comments for you, and can make it a little bit more formal. So that's another good way to do things. The next bullet item: when you get a license from the FCC, you're granted a license to operate on spectrum per the rules. And something that I've seen over the years many times is I'll hear somebody, as we do frequency coordination, well, that's my channel, you can't have it. Unfortunately, you don't own any of this spectrum. You're only granted a license to operate it under the rules. You don't own a frequency. All the spectrum is owned collectively by the federal government, and they allow you to operate on it. They may even, for commercial operations, they actually auction off the right to use it, but they don't auction off the ownership of the spectrum. So I think that's something that I've seen that I'd like to really point out and say, hey, you don't really want to go down that road of saying it's my channel and whatnot, because it gets you into a bad place if you're in a dispute. Look at the rules, be reasonable, see what can work to accommodate a problem if there is a problem. I'm going to just do a real short, as I called it, technical diversion. I just want to explain a little bit on frequency, because I'm going to go over the bands for you in the next slide that belong to public safety and kind of explain. We'll get into the licensing part now. But radio spectrum is 20,000 hertz. It's generally considered the low end. You won't see anybody really that low, other than the military for submarines, doing radio there, but it goes on up to 300 gigahertz, and you really won't see anybody way up there because it's too hard to do, and it's more like light up there than it is anything else. But in between is where all of our spectrum is, and to give you an idea, hertz is the name that's been given to a radio wave. 1 hertz is 1 cycle per second. I put a little graph of a cycle. The voltage or the current starts at 0 and it goes up to some maximum. It comes down to 0, goes to a negative and back to 0. That whole process is 1 cycle. And as you can see, if you've got when you're talking 300 gigahertz, that's actually 1 gigahertz is 1,000 megahertz. 1 megahertz is 1,000,000 hertz or 1,000,000 cycles per second. So as you can see, if you're up at 300, it's pretty high up. But our stuff lies in between, and hopefully this gives you just a short little reference for those that aren't too technical I'm hoping a picture of what we're talking about when we go over the bands.